All right, so let's jump into this deep dive on classical conditioning and Kovan. Have you ever heard of Pavlov? I mean, does that name ring a bell? Haha. Okay, bad jokes aside. Really, though, think about this. Have you ever, like, gotten a sudden craving for French fries just driving by, like, a McDonald's or something?
Hmm.
Or maybe felt your heart race a little bit when you hear a specific ringtone, the one you had for, like, an ex or something? Well, that's classical conditioning doing its thing. It's basically how our brains learn to connect different events together, and then, bam, you just automatically respond in a certain way. So how does this whole thing work? Well, it all starts with this incredible ability our brains have to link things together, what's called associative learning. Like, picture a dog running to the door when they hear the doorbell, right? They've learned to associate that sound with somebody coming in. So excitement and anticipation take over. But it's not just dogs. This happens to us all the time. Okay, so let me set the scene here. It's 1904, and we're in the lab of this guy, Ivan Pavlov, a Russian physiologist. He was actually studying digestion in dogs. I mean, he even won a Nobel Prize for his work on that in 1904. But then he stumbled onto something even more fascinating. So Pavlov was collecting dog saliva through a tube to measure, how much they drooled when they were given food. Pretty normal stuff, right? Well, here's where things get interesting. Pavlov noticed that the dog started drooling before the food even got there. Just seeing a lab coat, or hearing dishes clinking, or even the footsteps of the researcher coming down the hall, that was enough to get their salivary glands going. Like they were already predicting the food and getting ready. And this was Pavlov's big aha moment. He realized that the dogs were connecting these seemingly random cues with the food that was coming. They were learning. And this totally unintentional discovery opened up a whole new world of understanding about how we learn through association, even without really trying to. Pretty amazing, right? All right, so Pavlov kind of stumbles onto this whole fascinating thing, but to really get what's happening here, we're going to break down the lingo, Pavlov figured out the key parts in this learning process. They're sort of like, I don't know, the ingredients in a recipe for how this classical conditioning thing works. First up, you got what's called the unconditioned stimulus, or US for short. It's basically some of the triggers a natural, automatic response. No learning needed beforehand. Think of it like an ingredient that already has a strong flavor, right? In Pavlov's experiment, the food was the US. Makes sense, right? Then you have the unconditioned response, or UR. This is just the natural inborn reaction to the US. So for Pavlov and his dogs, the UR was all that drooling in response to the food. It's like a total reflex, like when the doctor taps your knee with that little hammer and your leg just jumps up. Okay, so now, here's where things get kind of interesting. Enter the neutral stimulus, or NS. This is something that at first doesn't really cause any particular reaction. Like in Pavlov's experiment, this was the sound of a bell. At the beginning, it meant nothing to those dogs. But the magic happens when we start pairing the NS with the US over and over again. So we ring the bell, that's the NS, right before we bring out the food, the US. And after a while, the dogs start connecting those two in their minds. Bell means food is coming. And get this, the bell alone starts to trigger drooling. The bell has now become a conditioned stimulus, or CS, and the drooling in response to the bell. That's the conditioned response, or CR. So to sum it all up, food, the US, leads to drooling, the UR. We pair a bell, the NS, with a food, the US, again and again, and eventually the bell alone, now the CS, makes those dogs drool, the CR. Pretty cool, huh? Now you might be thinking, okay, dogs drooling, bells ringing, what does any of this have to do with me? Let me tell you. Classical conditioning is happening everywhere around us, all the time. It's not just in some fancy lab. It's how we get scared of things, why we like certain things more than others, even how we respond emotionally to stuff. Take taste aversion, for example. Remember that time you ate some bad sushi and got totally sick, and then the next time you even thought about sushi, you felt a little queasy. Well, that's classical conditioning at work. The bacteria, the bad sushi, that was the US. That awful feeling you got, the sickness, that was the UR. At first, the sushi itself was just neutral, But after that whole bad experience, the sushi became a CS. And that feeling of nausea you get just thinking about it, that's your CR. Scientists actually call this the Garcia effect, and it shows just how powerful a single bad experience can be. It can totally make you avoid something like the plague. Fear conditioning, that works in a similar way. Imagine a kid who gets scared by a dog barking super loud. The loud bark, that's the US. And the kid freaking out, that's the UR. If this happens enough times, especially if the dog seems kind of mean, that kid might develop a fear of all dogs. The dog, which was just a neutral thing at first, becomes a CS. And their fear becomes a CR. But here's the thing, though. We can actually unlearn these associations. It's not permanent. And that's what therapies like exposure therapy are all about. Where they gradually expose you to what you're scared of, but in a safe and controlled way to help break that negative connection. So If you're afraid of spiders, a therapist might start by showing you pictures of spiders, right? Then as you get used to those, maybe they'll show you videos. Then you might watch a spider in a terrarium from far away. And eventually you might even work up to holding a harmless spider. With each step, that fear response gets a little weaker because you're learning that, hey, this spider isn't going to hurt me. It's not just about getting over fears, though. Classical conditioning can also work in positive ways. Ever notice how certain songs can take you right back to a certain time and place? And you get flooded with all these emotions. Or maybe how a specific smell can bring back vivid memories. That's classical conditioning, messing with your emotional landscape. Let's say you had an awesome first date at a restaurant, and there's this one song playing. Now every time you hear that song, you get this rush of happiness and excitement, even if you don't remember exactly why. The song has become a CS. Triggering those good feelings is a CR. It's like your own personal soundtrack to that happy memory. But it's more than just emotions. Classical conditioning affects our behavior too, often in subtle ways. Think about advertising for a sec. Advertisers are like experts at pairing their products with stuff. You know, images and sounds that make us feel good, like happy families, beautiful landscapes, catchy jingles. At first, these are all neutral stimuli. But after seeing them over and over, we start to associate those good feelings with the product itself. So even if it's just like a can of soda or a new pair of sneakers, we might feel happy or excited when we see them. Our brains are subconsciously drawn to those positive vibes. Now, I know all this might make you feel like we're just puppets, controlled by these associations, but that's not really the whole truth. Classical conditioning is definitely powerful, but we're not totally helpless. We can become aware of these influences and make our own choices. By understanding how classical conditioning works, we can start to see these patterns in our own lives. We can question our automatic responses and even challenge the ones that aren't really helping us. We can create new positive associations and break free from the ones holding us back. So the next time you're driving past that McDonald's and you suddenly crave French fries, or you hear that old ringtone and your heart starts racing, take a second to think about it. What associations have you formed? And how are they messing with your thoughts, feelings, and actions? It's all about becoming more aware of the invisible forces shaping our inner world, kind of like peeking behind the curtain. And with that, let's head over to the final part of our deep dive. We'll look at some common misconceptions about classical conditioning and leave you with some thought-provoking questions to chew on. Okay, so we're back for the last part of our deep dives into classical conditioning. We've covered a lot of ground here, from Pavlov and his drooling dogs to taste aversions, and even how advertisers use this stuff to get us to buy things. But before we wrap up, let's tackle some of those common misconceptions about classical conditioning. And I'll leave you with some stuff to think about. First off, classical conditioning. It's not like mind control or something. It's not about turning people into robots, who just blindly react to whatever's going on around them. It's a totally natural learning process that helps us navigate the world, helps us predict what's going to happen, and then respond, in a way that makes sense. Of course, marketers and advertisers, they try to use this to their advantage, right? We're not totally helpless. We can be aware of what they're doing and make our own decisions. Another misconception is that classical conditioning is all about like fear and negative reactions. And yeah, those examples need to be pretty dramatic. But remember, it's really all about making associations. And those associations can be positive too.
Like think about athletes who use visualization to get better. They're basically using classical conditioning to create a mindset that helps them succeed. Yeah, they imagine that feeling of winning. That's their US. And they pair that with specific actions or movements, And over time, those actions themselves can trigger those feelings of confidence and focus. So it's like they're building mental muscle memory for success. We can use classical conditioning to create positive associations in our everyday lives too. Like let's say you want to start exercising more. You could try pairing your workouts with something you really enjoy, like listening to your favorite playlist or grabbing a smoothie after you're done. And eventually, you might start associating exercise with those good feelings, so you're more likely to stick with it. It's like rewiring your brain to crave those endorphins, and those good vibes. Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a little challenge. Start paying attention to your own reactions throughout the day. Notice those times when you suddenly get a craving, or feel a wave of emotion, or just do something automatically. And ask yourself, what triggered that? What was it?
Can you trace it back to a specific experience or an association you've made? Once you start seeing the world through this lens, it's kind of amazing how much classical conditioning is going on around us all the time, subtly shaping our inner world in ways we never even realized. So even though Pavlov probably didn't actually use a bell in his experiment, turns out that was kind of made up. The idea behind it still holds true. Classical conditioning is a powerful force. It's constantly weaving its way through our experiences, our preferences, even our sense of self. By understanding how it works, we can really start to get who we are, how we learn, and how we can use this knowledge to shape our lives in a more positive and intentional way. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.